Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and we have another roundtable for you. Unfortunately, Eric Helms could not be here today because the time differences are just wacky right now for all of us, but I appreciate that both Menno and Mike Israetel can be here, so it's going to be a fantastic episode regardless. Today we are going to be talking about rest periods, lifting tempo, and metabolite work / pump work, metabolic stress, and their application to muscular hypertrophy. So I don't know if Menno, you'd like to start talking about how you'd go about recommending rest periods to people who are seeking hypertrophy.
Sure. First off, Mike, did you get married today?
Only in the technical legal sense, yes. It's not like a wedding or anything, but yeah, technically I'm no longer, you know what I'm saying? I guess it wasn't legal before, but yeah, officially married.
All right, congratulations, man.
Thank you so much.
All right. On to the topic of the day, rest periods. So I wrote a review a while back with Brad Schoenfeld on rest periods, and at that point I basically challenged the conventional wisdom, which was shared by both exercise scientists and most bros alike, that for bodybuilding, short rest periods were ideal. And the consensus was also from both practitioners and researchers, I'd say, that for strength, long rest periods were better. And I basically looked at all the research, and I've never really been convinced of the idea that short rest beats, or in general, I'm always skeptical of things that improve strength and then should be not just neutral, but actually negative for muscle growth. So in my review of the literature, I basically concluded that there was really no direct evidence whatsoever to support that short rest intervals are best for muscle growth. In fact, on the non-volume equated research, which means how it is in practice, you shorten your rest periods and therefore you cannot manage as many repetitions unless you actively add additional sets, but that's generally not what people do. There's actually at least one, I think, that found reduced muscle growth. Now, in spite of that, there was still the consensus that short rest was best. So that review sparked a lot of follow-up research, and now I think it's quite safe to say that rest intervals, they mainly matter because they affect your training volume, and they don't seem to have much of an independent effect, which means that generally, if you shorten your rest periods and your volume is not excessive or already very close to the optimal amount, but you're, say, on a low, moderate volume program, if you shorten your rest periods, that reduces how many repetitions you can do, which reduces overall training volume, and less training volume means less muscle growth. So in practical terms, the answer I'd say is often that shorter rest means less muscle growth. Now, it's also conceivable that if you're doing, and I see this in some of my own clients, if you're trying to optimize the volume, so you're pushing your volume way on the end of what you can recover from, MRV as Mike would call it probably, then if you then rest excessively long, it might actually cause you to overreach because you're accumulating just too much volume. So that's basically would be my cliff notes on the effect of rest interval on muscle growth.
Perfect. So you basically wouldn't limit rest periods. Would you kind of have an auto-regulation type of system going? So I don't know if breathing was back down, normalized, heart rate was back down a little bit. Is that how you basically go about it, or do you have general recommendations of a few minutes?
Yeah, it depends on the volume, because multiple setups can work, but I often use auto-regulated rest just because it's such a major pain in the ass to actually monitor your rest intervals. And so I generally tell people to go by performance, and if time is an issue, then I do restrict the rest periods, because it's generally actually more efficient to do more sets and have shorter rest periods than actually try to rest a long period, because after a minute rest for isolation work and about 2 minutes for compound work, it takes a long further time before you actually can do a lot more repetitions. And in that time, you could have done a set, even not with that many reps, but you could have still gotten quite a few reps in, which would be more time efficient. So you can get more volume in given a limited amount of time if you actually do a lot of sets with short rest periods than if you try to do very few sets with very long rest. So that's actually something that happens quite often because, not a lot of people cannot train 2 hours per day or whatever. Then where you have to fit in your training in a lunch break or something, then you do have to restrict them. And if you do want to auto-regulate them, I often recommend resting until you've caught your breath and you feel that your heart rate is normalized a bit.
Perfect. No, I really like that. And for Mike, do you have any other thoughts on that? Do you have a similar line of thought, or do you have any places where you might see shorter rest periods being efficacious?
Yeah, so I agree with pretty much everything Menno said. Can you hear me okay? I feel like I'm speaking quietly.
Yep.
So I think Menno's on the money for pretty much all of that. I still think there's some glimmer of hope for metabolite processes. There was a very, very indirect demonstration of lactic acid's ability to alter growth factors and very stem cell type of activity. Recently, I would say as a hypothesis generating research, not hypothesis demonstrating research for sure. But certainly, in any way you slice it, high reps, short rest, and a higher failure proximity a la myo-rep style, there's definitely something to that is a way to train, no matter the pathways that actually activates. But I think that pre-fatigued state is certainly enhances the efficiency of such an operation. So I think at that point, relatively short rest is a good idea. But that's when you start out with the sort of preconceived plan that this is the kind of training I'm doing. These are the kind of adaptations I'm targeting. I think that the idea of just shortening the rest no matter what is really, really bad. But there can be times where you're like, okay, I'm doing short rest on purpose right now because this is what I want to try to accomplish, and go after those either metabolite pathways or whatever, the myo-rep style training. Then short rest is, I think, critical. But in nearly other sort of straight sets conventional approach, a longer rest periods are just make more sense. And I will add another way in which they make sense that Menno, I'm sure, would have covered eventually. But in a practical setting with really, really taxing exercises, your local muscular fatigue is not the only kind of fatigue you experience. I can think of at least 3 other kinds of fatigue. There is psychological fatigue of like, fuck, I almost died. Like a set of 12 in the squat is the religious experience. It takes you time to nut up and do another set. And if someone's like, all right, 2 minutes is up, and that stopwatch bullshit that Menno was talking about, which sucks, you're like, wait, what the fuck? Where's my belt? Where's my ego? Where's my life? I don't want to do any more squats. And I mean, it's a serious thing. You got to get your shit together for a real productive set. Another kind of fatigue is synergist or stabilizer muscle or peripheral fatigue. So when you're squatting, your quads might be already recovered, but your lower back might not be recovered yet, and it just needs another minute. Now, if it gets another minute, it's an awesome squat set you got coming up, another 12 reps. But if you do a minute rest less, it could be like 2 reps in the squat, and then your lower back starts to be the limiting factor. You get another 1.5 reps, you dump the bar, and you're like, that was a wasted set. And Menno's absolutely right that you can always add sets to get volume equivalency, but that's a shitty way to go about things. And all of a sudden, you have to do like another 8.5 reps. Fuck that. Like, this is just if I had only rested 1 more minute, I would just had much more of a quality set. Another concern, again, in those big compound heavy movements is your aerobic limiting factors. I mean, after a good high rep set of leg presses or squats or lunges, you're breathing heavy. It doesn't matter if it's been 2 minutes already. Your quads are no longer the limiting factor. It's now your lungs and your heart. And you're not there to train your lungs and your heart. You're there to get jacked. So you better have let your aerobic system at least catch up to, like Menno said, your heart rate's relatively normal again, and your breathing is normal. Like, the worst thing ever is when people overinterpret the literature and have like a 2-minute stopwatch, and they're like, all right, 2 minutes is up, your next squat set, and the guy's like, okay, try and put it on your belt. Like, that's just stupid. It leads to really low quality training. It leads to efficiency drops, and I would say arguably leads to a much poorer mind-muscle connection, which you've seen is important, at least in, There's two ways to squat. There's squatting in whichever way just gets the weight up and hits depth, and there's squatting with a nice upright stance, keeping your heels flat and really feeling the quads. Especially for more advanced lifters, that first way of squatting is just going to get you hurt. And the second way of squatting, the proper way, is just good, high-quality, targeted training. You can't do that first way if you're still vomiting fucking blood out of your nose because you didn't rest long enough, going for some arbitrary rest time that you've sort of told yourself. So I think that people like I literally have people come up to me and my training partner, Charlie, who's an 800-pound squatter, and every now and again they'll be like, how much rest do you guys take between sets? And we're like, as long as we need to feel like human beings again so we can do another set. And he'd be like, yeah, I take 2 minutes. I'd be like, 2 minutes is just long enough for me to stop feeling like I have to throw up from the last set. It just doesn't work. Like now, with curls, with tricep extensions, can you do like the 2 minute rest or 1.5 minute timed rest? Yeah, sure, whatever. That's fine, right? That's not centrally taxing. But as soon as exercises become centrally taxing, you got at least 3 other considerations there, including psychological, other muscles, and basically heart, lungs, cardiovascular. And boy, oh boy, that stuff needs to be, because if you don't tend to it, some of those things are in combination will be limiting factors instead of your musculature. And then I'm not really sure what you're training. Can you imagine someone doing like a set of 10 in the bench and then the next set of 5 and you're like, oh man, did you really feel it in your chest? Like, no, I just ran out of air. And you're like, I guess that's not why we're here. And no, it's not, right? So, and then people say, well, how much rest do I realistically need? There's a top end to that. You see guys resting so long, you're not there to have the perfect sets. You're there to have good workable sets to really take good chunks of targeted safe training off of your total daily volume goal. If you want the perfect set, then you'll rest there's actually like 2 post-activation potentiation peaks. There's one after like a minute or 2. There's another one after like 8 minutes. 8 minutes is when you're in a powerlifting or weightlifting competition. You don't rest 8 minutes between sets unless you're enormous, right? And then all those curves are longer. Then your second peak is like at 20 minutes or something. You don't wait for that second peak. You don't want to cool down completely between sets because some people take the rest intervals don't matter. They post the study on PubMed. Then they're like, yeah, my Shaco routine takes 4.5 hours to do per session. What the fuck is wrong with you? Are you dead halfway through? Like, yeah, just like sometimes I'm on my phone for 15 minutes between sets. Ha ha ha. And you're like, all right, you're just pissing away time. And there's, imagine this. You rest twice as long. The quality of the set is the same, and you manage 2 more repetitions per set than you otherwise would. Is that worth it? Oh my God, it's not worth it at all. And because the muscle pump and is literally, the cell swelling is connected to hypertrophy, and at least in some causative way, you're actually missing out on the muscle pump effect and any potential metabolite effect and any potential pre-fatiguing effect. So there is such a thing as resting too long. What that comes down to is for bigger, stronger lifters, 3 to 6 minutes is realistic for compound heavy basics. 2 to 4 minutes is realistic for things like maybe dumbbell shoulder presses or pull-ups or things like that. Bicep curls, tricep extensions, like Menno said, whenever you feel pretty good again, you're ready to go and you hit another good set, you're fine. Could be 35 seconds later for calf raises. My calves, I can do calf raises and 15 seconds later, I feel completely fine. There's no lactic acid. There's 0 central effects. I go again. It's just a lot of really great time. Forearms, same way. I can do forearms and then I move on. Biceps is a little more. Triceps a little more. Chest a little more, so on and so forth. But basically, when you feel good again and you're not doing metabolite training, that's when you go, but keep yourself in check, relatively speaking. You want to feel good, not optimal. Because if you're looking to feel optimal, you just need to leave the session after a single set, come back 3 hours later and hit it again. Then you'll feel real great. Just be wasting your time a lot.
I thought that was brilliantly spoken, Mike, because I think there's a lot of practical limitations to kind of trying to give rest periods because there's so many different exercises. Like you said, like if you're doing a bicep curl versus doing a squat, there's going to require different rest periods. And then the size of the lifter, the strength of the lifter is going to impact it as well. I know when I did one-on-one personal training, you have females and you think they might need a while to rest between a squat, but they do not. So I think the auto-regulation approach is brilliant, but with that kind of idea in mind that you can rest too long, because I know, and I think people who have done long diets, I know both of you have competed. So, towards that end point, you kind of are resting and almost forgetting that you're in the gym to do work. And that can bite you in the arse sometimes as well, I think. I don't know if Menno, you've got any kind of rebuttal to Mike's points there. We won't quite talk on metabolic stress yet, but or you can go on to the lifting tempo.
No rebuttal. I agree with everything Mike said. I think 2 interesting things that he touched on. is there's indeed research showing that isometric muscle contractions actually are more fatiguing than dynamic ones, which is contrary to what many people would say. But that might explain why squats and deadlifts, especially if you do them very, very short rest intervals, can, especially in later sets, really start to feel like it's just your back that's limiting performance. So there, extra rest is warranted to make sure that you get decent recovery in all the muscles. And second is that, as Mike also said, in other words, the idea of complete recovery, which you see in a lot of exercise science, is a joke in practice. So this idea that you have studies and they show, okay, complete recovery was seen after 2 minutes. That might be the case for some novice level lifters that aren't really training that hard. But in my experience, if you take a set to failure, or even like 1 rep to failure, maybe even 2, you might not have full recovery ever. That workout, you need to rest literally like an hour or something before you actually have full recovery. If you took a set of like a 12 RM of squats, like Mike said, and you actually do your 12 RM or your 13 RM maybe, then you're probably not going to be able to hit 12 reps again, unless you're a woman, within about an hour for many people. Like some people have good work capacity and they can stay pretty close to it. Some people actually can hit their 12 RM twice, but it's quite rare for many people. It's actually normal to have quite a big drop. So I think that's also something many people obsess over their work capacity, how many repetitions they lose, and there is enormous individual variability, and many things like your training status impacted, type of exercise, gender. So that's something I think also a lot of people rest too long because they're aiming for that ideal full recovery because they read on PubMed it takes 3 minutes for full recovery for compounds work. It's basically that full recovery is generally something you may not see. Like some people see it, but a lot of people don't. So it's not something you should expect or aim for. So I often tell people, like in instruction, when you feel ready to perform well again, rather than actively instructing people are fully recovered. Because
okay. When I squatted a couple years back, I squatted 500 pounds for 10 reps, and that is on YouTube. It was probably 1 rep short of failure. The next set, which was not televised, I rested about 6 to 10 minutes, and the next set I hit 4 repetitions.
Wow!
I was trying. It was a real effort. And also, Menno said something. He said people obsess about getting the same number of reps with each set. Every fucking day on Instagram, like I posted my hack squat results. I did hack squat for 17 or 15 reps, 13 reps, 11 reps, 9 reps, 7 reps. And someone's like, Dr. Mike, why are the reps going down? Is it because you're using more weight? I'm like, no. They're like, is it because something's wrong? Like, are you sick? I'm like, well, how the fuck does your training look? Can you really just be like, what? First of all, why does it matter? And I always ask people, why does it matter? And they're like, well, and then you realize that the thing you thought mattered, you have no idea why you thought it mattered. You know what I mean? Like, it's just one of those things, like, it just never really is like, okay, how does it affect the total volume load? It doesn't. What else matters for hypertrophy? Not much. Okay. Like, but it's not a set of 10. Like, well, average is 10. Like, okay. People just don't get it. They're just like, oh my God, this is terrible. And they're like, but how do you keep track? I'm like, well, I write down the reps in 1 week, and then the next week I try to get the same reps or more, or use more weight with the same total volume or more. And they're like, huh. Okay, so I think that obsession with the keeping things the same is a wild goose chase. It really is, because it leads nowhere. It's pointless. You'll have a good day, you'll have a bad day, and it's one extra variable that is completely useless to obsess over. Which is one reason why I used to consider, I want to consider myself optimal and scientific and shit. And I used to kind of get like, not jealous, but like be like, man, am I really thinking this through? When I saw people with stopwatches in training, monitoring everything. And I was like, oh man, I'm just not hardcore enough. And then I gave it a lot more thought. And I was like, those people are sort of superimposing a level of precision that alters their effectiveness into the negative. It's like timing your meals or counting how many breaths you take per day. Superfluous, artificial, top-down sort of constriction that goes nowhere.
Yeah,
Mike,
I think it's also just one quick thing. You also see it in exercise science. I think it's just because a lot of people don't train that hard. So yeah, in some papers you see like the subjects perform 4 sets of 8 with their 8 RM to failure.
Like,
how? That doesn't work. It's impossible. If you did an 8 RM, then there's no way you're going to get another 8 RM. Like, there's a few people who can do that, but most can't. It's certainly not the average.
Menno, I used to actually, I never end up doing this because I didn't want to be a dick. I wanted to write the journal editors for those papers and be like, how did you approve this to be published in your journal? Did anyone send in a request for raw data or a request for clarification of methods? Like, so you're saying that the 8 reps to failure, 4 sets straight, like, with their 8 RM, Nobody? No, nothing? This doesn't bother anyone? And the funny thing is, a lot of the journal reviewers are people who don't train. So they're like, oh, sounds great. And you're like, it doesn't sound great. That's why it's really cool having researchers like Brad Schoenfeld publishing data, because some of his study designs are a little interesting. And people are like, Brad, why didn't you equate such and such? And he's like, because you can't equate this in the real world. And they're like, well, I would. And it's like, shut up. You don't train. Get out of here. Okay, fine. Have every set taken to failure and have the same number of reps. Go do it. It's just one of those things that's comical. And that's when they say, evidence-based practice is really bridging the gap between exercise science and actual practical experience. But this is exactly what they're talking about. Like, if you just read the PubMed stuff, you're like, every rep to failure, every set to failure, 4 by 8. And you're like, okay, those are mutually exclusive. You got to pick one of them, man. And
my only point on that, I was going to say, Mike, is do you have a limit in which you allow a drop off in repetitions? I guess this is related to MRV and kind of performance and what you might expect there, because I think listeners might be like, oh, can I just keep just doing more and more sets and letting the reps drop off because of fatigue? There's going to be a limit to that, isn't there?
So you have to consider the practicality of if volume is your target and you're okay with the intensity dropping based on your training design. What you do is at some point, you do 3 or 4 sets, and if your reps go below something that it's just going to take a lot of sets of that to add up to volume, like 5 and less, then you just take weight off the bar and start doing sets of 12 or 10 again, and you get to the volume you want faster. In that particular hack squat example, I've never gone lower than 7 reps. And when I add a set to that, I could usually do another 7, because recovering from 7 on relatively light weights, I just take an extra 30 seconds of rest and I can do 7 again, because it's not to failure, right? It's just that when you do 15 reps on the hack squat and you're using like 400 plus pounds, you don't just do 15 reps again. And you can if you want to go to failure, but if you're doing a short of rest, short of failure, then it's just not practical, and you have to let your reps drop off a little bit. So yeah, practically you can eventually let the load go if it's under 5 or something. But again, look, if you have another 5 reps left in your total volume target and you have another set, you don't have to just do another set of 5. That's it. Set of 5 is not going to make you, not because you'll say like, well, that's not in the hypertrophy range. Well, you misunderstood the entire hypertrophy range is a practicality range. It is not a range of saying if you do 3 reps, you simply will not gain hypertrophy and you'll just gain power or some shit like that. But that's a whole other topic.
Awesome. So I don't know if Menno, you want to bridge lifting tempo now. So kind of, the speed of the cadence of the bar and in different positions. A lot of people have, super slow training in mind maybe, or kind of time under tension, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. One tangent though on the previous question you asked, which I think is interesting. And that is basically what you're saying is, you're monitoring the repetition drop-off across reps, then you're monitoring work capacity. So you can measure that with something like a fatigue index. It's basically the percentage drop from set 1 to the last set if you're using the same weight across all sets. And what it basically means is the amount of neuromuscular fatigue that you have accumulated. Basically, your work capacity or your fatigue should drop off across sets, the amount of neuromuscular that you have produced, like 50% fatigue. And it's a useful metric, I find, in that you can use that as a gauge to see if someone's volume can go up or down. Because if you see that someone is not acute, well, for one, you can question if they're training hard enough. But secondly, if they are on volume, because evidently they're not accumulating that much fatigue yet, so they're quite fatigue resistant. And also corresponds with women generally tolerating more volume and also having higher work capacity. And if you see that someone has really, really poor work capacity, like I have pretty poor work capacity for quite a lot of exercises, and it's not too uncommon for my reps to go like 12, 6, 3. And then it's probably a good idea to, especially with my high frequency kind of training that I often use, probably a good idea to call it quits, because you've evidently already accumulated a lot of fatigue. So if anything, you might want to see if you can reduce the volume by a set. Because that last set is only 3 reps and it's quite a lot of additional fatigue. So I think using work capacity as a sort of, as Mike said, hypothesis generating tool in practice, or if you can up or decrease the volume. All right, for your original question, tempo. Tempo is an interesting topic in that the research on it is really, really poor. It's scarce. Overall, what they studied in tempo, like they compare a 4-second to a 2-second tempo. It's like, what did you manipulate? The concentric, the eccentric? Was there a pause? Which part of the movement was actually manipulated? And often they don't say it. Like, so we do have some studies that make it explicit. Then we also have a lot of them manipulate both the concentric and the eccentric. So we don't know what the effect is caused by. Like if there's an improvement in strength, is it because they're doing the concentric faster or the eccentric slower or the other way around? So if you lump everything together, there doesn't appear to be much effect. I think the effect of tempo is a lot like that of your rest interval, that it mainly matters because it affects your training volume. And I'm generally inclined to say that an explosive, or at least a concentric aimed at maximum performance, is the way to go for most people, because the thing we have the most consistent data on is that an explosive concentric helps strength development. Yeah, so fast concentric has the most support for strength development. Muscle growth, not so much, but at least if it helps strength and doesn't hurt muscle growth, that's a win. And in the long term, more strength may aid muscle growth. So for the eccentric, I'd say you do want to control it. Like you see some people just dive bomb the weight, like in a squat, for example. And if you're not even resisting the downward phase for at least a free weight exercise, then there isn't any eccentric muscle contraction. And we do know you want an eccentric muscle contraction. So in that sense, you definitely want to at least have control over the weight. Like I often use the cue that you should be able to stop the movement at any point if you wanted to. You don't do it, but you should be able to. And then if you slow it down even further, there's one study by Pereira et al. That found it was a trend, not statistical significance, but it was a trend for increased muscle growth. But there are 2 others that find no effect. So I'm not very convinced. And that one study was 1 for 3 seconds in, I think, preacher curls. So a 1 second drop for a preacher curl is that's like 1, which is almost a free fall. So in that sense, I think again it's more to do with control and my muscle connection, if you will, than actually the tempo itself.
Perfect. So yeah, controlled eccentrics and explosive concentrics for the most part. That sounds about the summary there. Mike, do you have the same opinion on tempo?
Mm-hmm. Oh man, everyone was roboted for that one. So yeah, I think Menno's discussion was very comprehensive. Just to kind of sum up what I'm relatively sure Menno would agree with here is kind of a practical take home. If you don't have to do a fast concentric if you don't want to, especially in some exercises you might not feel safe doing it. That's okay. As long as it's like moving it, getting your reps done, I think you're doing well. But ideally, I think a fast concentric on a lot of, especially compound movements, would probably err on the side of being likely to be more effective, particularly for faster twitch muscle fibers and things like that. And I think that the eccentric can be anywhere from, for sure, controlled, so no dive bombing, but anywhere from there to an exaggerated several second long eccentric may have some benefits or just be an interesting variation to use. But if you start getting really funky with like 12-second eccentric or holding at the bottom for a minute straight, you're just missing away energy where you could be doing more reps. And then, so a pretty convincing summary of, I think Brad summarized the data on super slow training, where when you get into 4 seconds, you're like, man, you get into 10 seconds, it's for sure negative effect on hypertrophy. So it's one of those things where If you're doing it to really feel the eccentric contraction and still produce good, meaningful work, I think you might be advantaging yourself and or just variation. If you start getting fancy, and you kind of know when you're training too, like let's say you normally use 300 pounds for squats, and now you're using only 180, but really slow eccentrics. You're like, I know I'm fucking bitching out. Like, that's what I'm doing. I'm just trying not to use heavy weight. And you, after the workout, someone come up to you, be like, do you really feel like you've been really like stimulated? Was it a really hard workout? And you're like, no. Be like, if I told you that you could only do 2-second eccentrics, would it be harder or easier? It'd be like, for the RIR to be the same, it would be harder because it would be more weight, it'd be a bigger pain in the ass. But like, that's probably going to grow you more. You're like, yeah, I need that. I'm just trying to get away. So I think a lot of people who get into the really slow eccentrics, they're actually just trying to avoid the pain and the work it takes to really grow. So I think anywhere between a 4-second eccentric and a 1-second eccentric still under control, anything between a get it done concentric and a do it explosively, I think is totally cool. I think Menno and I would both be very hard pressed to offer very convincing case for anything in that range being just for sure better. Like if someone comes in and if Menno and I see someone doing a 3-second eccentric, neither one of us is going to be like, well, you're really fucking that up because 1.5 is what the research says. So I don't know, Menno, is that like a decent summary of things?
Yeah. It's hard to argue that a slower eccentric would actually be worse.
Yeah.
Cool. And actually, on a related note, I think maybe some of the listeners are thinking about these other elements of training where we've got maybe the stretch reflex being involved, whether, because you kind of talked about dive bombing obviously not being wanted, but maybe a stretch reflex in some areas might be beneficial or not, and maybe using a pause as a variation. Should we be using a stretch reflex on things like a squat? Is that something that we should be doing? I know, Mike, you've spoken about this before. Do you want to kind of touch on that?
So I think that if you're training for pure hypertrophy, I think that eventually the bigger and stronger you get, from the trade-off of injury management, you're going to go into the direction of pausing most of your lifts. Not all of them. Some are impossible to pause. Some pausing is just a waste of time. But I think a considerable amount of lifts you want to pause, especially lifts like the bench press. Sometimes lifts like the squat, maybe the deadlift under some circumstances. Pausing lets you reset. It lets you make every rep the same, and lets you avoid really grandiose forces that could actually get you hurt. Like if you're benching over 150 kilos for reps and you're a physique athlete, especially if you're starting a diet and you're getting pretty lean, I don't like to see not paused benches because I've seen too many guys get hurt. Now it's just a part of training. But I just think you have to ask the question of, okay, if you're a track and field athlete and you want reactive strength, should you be pausing? No. You're a bodybuilder. Just move the fucking weight and do it in a very safe way. I think pauses also allow standardization and a bit of safety. How insistent am I on that people pause? I think when you're beginning training, when you're still weak or small or you just haven't had much experience, I don't think pausing is very important because you're just not strong enough to hurt yourself yet. When I see a guy who's really enormous and really strong, not pausing lifts like bench presses and incline presses, I just feel like, man, you could be getting damn near the same amount of stimulus, a little less arguably because of the lower forces, because most of the highest forces in a lift or like bench press are actually seen in the transitional phase between concentric and eccentric. But you just do 2 or 3 more reps per workout and you get the same amount of stimulus because force is not a limiting factor in hypertrophy. So if you're using sufficiently heavy weights and you pause them, you could just be doing really good technique, having good standardization, and just keeping yourself from sort of kind of needless injuries. It's really hard to get hurt when you're pausing your presses and pausing your squats. I pause almost all of my squats now, especially the heavy ones, because I'm to a point with my strength, I don't fucking wave my own flag here, that I just don't want to risk quad injury for seemingly no outcome at all. And if I was a power lifter, I wouldn't pause everything because you have to do a squat in competition without pausing it. So I don't know.
Menno, you have the same opinion with kind of pauses being beneficial for maybe more when you're a bit stronger, and maybe you don't need to pause so much when you are of the weaker side?
Mm-hmm. First, let me check. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I think it's definitely true for I think for really advanced trainees, it's definitely true. And I generally recommend pauses in free cases, so really advanced trainees. And this mostly concerns people on gear, though. because that's when you really see strength levels that basically exceed the body's and the tendons' capacity to handle them. In the case of many natural powerlifters, for example, that are genetically gifted for powerlifting, in my experience, they often also have iron joints. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that's one of the big requirements for being a successful natural powerlifter, to have iron joints. Because for me, for example, I could have the strength, but my joints would never tolerate it. So in that scenario, definitely there's just not much benefit and a lot of risk with using the stretch reflex. However, for people that don't have connective tissue issues, the stretch reflex is something that I like to use because it's not just passive. Many people think it's purely elastic energy storage, but it actually potentiates motor output. So it actually increases muscle activation. It's so it's a potentiating effect in the brain, basically. And in that respect, increased muscle activation, more work, should translate into more growth. For beginners, I also like pauses because it's a great way to learn technique. And again, for injury management, injured trainees and stuff, I think that this ties into other considerations for tempo than pure muscle growth, which is, can you accurately monitor your progression? Does it, do your connective tissues tolerate it? And what was the third one? I think those are the two main. Technique. Yeah, technique. So exactly. So I think those are the main issues to consider. And overall, it's going to be a very, very small effect. And based on that, I decided for most trainees. Oh yeah, there's another thing: the resistance curve of the exercise. So some exercises, if for example you would pause in the contracted position of most pulling exercises, that will greatly limit how many reps you can do. Like if you're doing a face pull and you're pausing in the contracted position, that is going to cut your repetitions in half, basically. So because that is the point in the exercise that is most difficult. Now in a bench press, if you pause on the bottom, the sticking point is actually a bit off the chest. So it doesn't really cost you much strength in volume. So basically, the more volume it costs you, the greater the loss with the pause. That's the point.
Brilliant.
Just another thing on that really quick. I would say that just to add to Menno's, absolutely on the money about the strength curve. There's also another way in which pauses can be bad. It's when your setup is bleeding a lot of energy out of you. So if you're doing a chest supported row and you want to pause at the bottom, totally cool because you're just holding on. And if you're strapped in, who cares? If you're doing a bent over row, you don't just pause at the bottom because you have to stay erect all the time. You'll just shit out like 5 reps because you spent time pausing for no fucking reason while energetically very taxing. So like another one is stopping at the bottom of the leg press and at the top of the leg press. Kind of totally cool because you're pretty buckled in, no big deal, you're not going anywhere. Stopping for too long at the bottom on top of squats, I mean, you're burdened the entire time. There's only so long your spine can stay upright under that much weight. So it's one of those things like, you got to consider the setup. A lot of times with some more restricted setups where your body's being helped, pauses are a bit more realistic even on machines. But sometimes when you have to sort of have your body just constantly using energy, like as soon as you're in the exercise, you got to sort of get. So when you're done, you're done. With pull-ups, as an interesting example where I think there's that very fine middle line for many people, not all people. If you don't pause at all and you rock it right out of the pull-up, it's pretty dangerous, especially for the distal tricep tendon and things like that, or sort of proximal tricep tendon, the long head. You can have some injury issues there if you just rock it right out of the bottom of every pull-up, shoulder stuff. But if you pause every pull-up, like people will pause and then go, ooh, and then go like that, it's like you could have done like 2 reps with all that energy. It also to grabbing the handle, your grip starts to go, all the stuff. So it's one of those like pull-ups. I think almost ideally you get to the top and then go down, stretch, and then come back up. Don't piss away too much time down there, and don't come back up too fast. I think a lot of that can work for a lot of exercises. Menno, did you have any comments on that?
No, I agree 100%.
No, I think actually speaking to that, I personally can really, really think of that towards the squat, kind of when you not dive bombing, but controlling into that hole and getting that stretch, so it actually helps. And same with pull-ups. I found myself, if I kind of control down, don't pause, but just like you just get that little bit of a kind of ping and it potentiates the next rep. So no, I really like those takeaway points. I don't know if we probably don't have quite enough time to go deep into metabolic stress. But I would also like to touch on potentially other aspects of the ways of varying our training or hypertrophy training. And one way we've seen people, I think, is becoming more and more prevalent is use of bands. I don't know if I think I've seen Mike training a fair amount. I've never really seen you using a band. I don't know if Menno, you use bands with any of your programming.
Yeah, a lot. I use basically whenever a trainee has bands, one of my clients, then I use them. Like there's almost always an exercise that can benefit from them. I'm very big into equating strength and resistance curves. So your strength curve should roughly equate to the resistance curve of the exercise, so that you don't have very obvious sticking points and you're actually overloading the exercise across its entire range of motion. And more importantly, overloading the muscle under as large a portion of its length as possible. So when you can use bands on the bench press, like there are some practical issues sometimes. Overhead press, it could work, but in practice it's just very awkward. Squats, I'm a big proponent. It really helps reduce back pain. Most people really like it, chains and bands and the squat. Deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts, it can work. It really shifts the emphasis a bit. So I don't really like it for women because you're adding vertical force and not horizontal. So for women, I like often that are focused on their glutes. I like more American style deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts where you really push the hips through. The bands change not just the how much tension there is across the movement, but it actually alters which muscles are more activated a lot. So with bands, deadlifts become a lot more trap dominant than otherwise. And that's why I often don't use them for women, but I do like them for men. But in general, it's I see little downside, basically, other than the setup time, which can be an issue if people are time restricted, and a lot of potential gain. So there's a lot of research showing that bands improve rate of force development and strength development, not so consistently, but overall definitely, and a meta-analysis shows it as well. Muscle growth, not as much research on, but again, at least it will help with strength, rate of force development, and that may in the long run aid muscle growth. So I'm a big proponent of accommodating resistance whenever I can use it.
Cool. Very interesting. Mike, have you got any thoughts on kind of bands and on what Menno said there?
Yeah, I think some exercises are the bands are really conducive to helping them match their resistance curve to the strength curve. Some exercises are not. I'm also a big fan of the loaded stretch. I think it's a valuable part of the hypertrophy stimulus. And I think that if you overuse band tension, that you end up having to use so little weight that the loaded stretch is meh, and then you have a lot of lockout, which could have just, I don't know, done partials or something. So I think bands are good if they are limited to relatively lower band tension. I think when you start generating hundreds of kilos of band tension a la West Side, you're training for equipped powerlifting at that point. I think there are definitely some exercises in which band tension is a really good idea. Various kinds of tricep extensions are almost ideally suited to that because of strength curve stuff. I think that if you do some upright rows and you really want to target the delts, a lower bar weight and some band tension on a Smith machine or something can really let you feel the side delts like you never really felt in upright rows before, because you can't just ride the momentum of the row to the top and be like, man, I did it. And you're like, all right, how are the side delts? You're like, I don't know. I mostly use my biceps to get up there. But if the incremental load gets higher and higher, you will have to pull your elbows up at the top and really feel it. So I think leg presses are another one. People like some band tension. There's a lot of it, just at the bottom, it's really hard, but then the rest of the rep is like super fucking easy. So I think there's definitely some opportunities. Like Menno said, I just play a little bit more on the conservative side of the setup time and the setup consistency too. If someone has a home gym or a dependable gym and they don't travel much and they want to progressively overload with very good sort of tracking, and if they have their own bands and they have a good setup, then great. But if like you have like 2 pairs of bands at the gym and some cocksucker's using them when you get in and your machine is taken normally and you have to set it up on another one, like who the fuck does that? Also, I've seen people try to do bands with like dumbbell bench press and incline press, and I just think that's the most gigantic fucking waste of time trying to kill yourself. It's just trying to find ways to kill yourself in the gym. Also, when people run out of dumbbell press weight and they have their training partner hold another dumbbell right on top of the dumbbell setup, so that, I don't know if you guys have ever seen that. That's just like, you should have just done barbell presses, you fucking idiot. And it's always half reps anyway, but we're getting off. So sometimes I feel like people are using bands with no foresight or intelligence. They just think there's some kind of cool little trip. Like, this is actually very prevalent in training, is thinking that things have an almost potion-like magical quality to them, that things are universally just an addition of good. So like, paprika is a good spice, right? But you don't add it into chocolate cake thinking of, but with paprika, it'll be better. Like, what do you think? We use paprika today? Like, yeah, sure, great. Make a macaroni and cheese, fucking paprika, right? You use it in its kind of dishes that you're supposed to use it with other spices. So bands are to be used intelligently in places where you plan to use them, in places that are effective. I think some people are like, curls today, and the bro's like, yeah, what about with bands? And it's like, oh, fuck yeah, that'll fuck us up. Like, well, if it fucks you up so well, why don't you use it all the time? Well, I don't know. Like, of course you don't know. You don't fucking think about a goddamn thing. Sorry, bro, rant.
No, great. The only question I've got, I guess, is out of my own personal interest. I don't think I've ever seen you use bands. And I'd be interested to think whether you think you're missing, if people are missing out on anything, or if it's just a tool variation.
I think you can get away with designing your program in other ways that you do not require the use of bands. But I think that if you have bands to use, and especially if you're low on variance, if you train in a garage gym with just a power rack, I think bands are starting to look really, really, really good idea to increase the variation and hit parts of the strength curve, parts of the muscle that you normally wouldn't hit. If you have a hack squat and you have a leg press, you have a regular squat, you might not need bands to get optimal development or something close to it. But if you have just a power rack, you're going to need all kinds of ways to vary the training to alter strength curves to basically create different exercises. Because now you have 2 exercises. You have squat and you have banded squat at the very least, which is a very, very different movement. I don't think I'm missing out on a ton. Potentially later in my career, when I'm all fucked up from doing regular weights and I still want to grow, I might use some band stuff. I'm always trying to save. I'm just trying to grow from as little technological stuff as possible, as little variation as possible, so that I can save it for when I'm all fucked up and I can't squat and bench and deadlift anymore. I think, just going back to that earlier point, if I came up to Menno at a gym and he was using bands, my question would be, why are you using those? He'd have a really good answer. So just be like Menno and have a good answer. Because if I come up to you at a gym and you're using bands, like, why are you using those? Because, fucking like force curve or whatever. And shut the fuck up. Like, you're just using shit to say you're using shit and you have no plan. And a lot of people use bands one workout and it won't the next. And, that the whole progression goes out the window, et cetera.
Cool. I don't know if you have any response to that, Menno, or I don't know if you guys have time. Menno could go over just his favorite exercises that he uses that on, because if you use them fairly regularly in your programming.
For sure. Yeah, I agree with everything Mike said. It's really important to get the band tension just right. Otherwise, you're solving the problem with one sticking point and you're just creating a new one further up the movement. So, and then there's no point whatsoever. No pun intended. So, I think that's really important. Setup as well. You need a constant setup. Otherwise, it's just a new exercise every time you train. For the record, I often cannot use bands myself because I travel a lot. Most gyms don't have bands. And I only have one band because everything is in literally 2 suitcases. So I often cannot use them myself, but if I am in a location for at least a month where I'll have them, then or if I have clients in such a scenario, I really love bands for the bench press or the squats. Those are probably the exercises I use it most often, because it reduces injury risk a lot, in my experience. Right, so shoulder injury risk in the bench press way lower with bands, and knee injury risk and especially back injury risk seems to be lower with squats. And those are definitely the ones I use it most often. Incline press, I also like it. Some machines you can actually use bands quite well with if you're a bit creative. But good machines have a good resistance curve already, so they don't need them. There aren't really any super exercises where I'd say like there you really need the bands. One thing that's actually good to mention. I'm not a fan of using bands for pull-ups at all, because it actually it's sort of the opposite of what you want to do with the resistance curve, and you can get someone really strong at pull-ups with bands or chin-ups, or a woman often, and they still can't do shit with regular chin-ups or pull-ups because it's a completely different exercise. It doesn't feel at all like a normal chin or pull-up. So I'm a much bigger fan of negatives, partials, half reps, than using bands. I've not seen good results with that, really. I mean, it can work for sure. It's one way to implement progressive overload if someone's not strong enough for full chin or pull-ups, but I don't think they're optimal.
I guess bands are generally used to help the portion that's the hardest, not to make the hardest portion even harder.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think on exercises for like vertical pulling movements, and I would actually say horizontal pulling movements as well. I love machines for the back that make the bottom portion, whether it's here or here, harder, and the top portion easier. Not only because it allows you to do more effective reps, so to speak, with a strength curve that's better matched to resistance curve, but it also, and this is super fucking lame, but it lets me really fucking feel like mind muscle bullshit at the bottom of a pull down or at the top of a row, really arch and squeeze the fuck out of it, and then get that eccentric damage pulling real bullshit and then squeeze again. I hate it when it's the other way around. You get to the bottom of a row and you're like, I can do this forever. And you get to the top and you get to here and you're like, ugh. And they're like, how'd you feel that in your lats? I'm like, I didn't feel that anywhere except for my fucking forearms and biceps. Fuck this. Right? But the other way around is just this miraculous back pumping disaster where you get off a machine after 5 sets and you're like, I can't move. My back's go. Where's my back? And you can't wash your own armpits and shit. Sweet. But like Menno was saying, bands with pull-ups literally do the opposite. They do the wrong kind. So you can, the top's already easy. Who gives a shit? And then the bottom's now, like it's just it lets you get the illusion that you can do a whole lot of pull-ups. And then the band comes off and you're like, blah. So how are you doing? You're like, I don't know. Usually there's a band for this part. You're like, well, there's your problem. So I think bands can be used to help people do pull-ups in the context of a progressive plan to make their back stronger through pull-downs, assisted pull-ups, and rows to make it bigger, right, to support later strength, and for them to lose some fat, which a lot of times helps a lot. Weight loss, fat loss helps a lot, and that's probably the number one reason people can't do pull-ups is just the strength-to-body weight ratio sucks. And also, in that progression towards the end, you can use some very light bands to get like sets of 10 or 12 pull-ups with bands in. Then you might be able to do like sets of 5 with regular pull-ups. But if you're like, I did a set of 5 with a band, am I ready to do regular pull-ups? Like, no, you're ready to do a single maybe. So I think there's just this big chasm there people don't see.
Brilliant. No, I think unless you guys have any other kind of variations or nuanced ways of changing exercises, we can probably call that a good day. I think that was a great kind of chat between the two of you, and I think there was many practical takeaways for the listeners.
Sure. Yep.
I just like just trying to summarize shit lately because I feel like we all rant about a ton of shit and then people like watch it and they're like, ugh, okay, I learned something, I guess. I just want just public service announcement. Don't get super caught up in the variations of the details that folks are doing. Like, I'll do a squat and people are like, Dr. Mike, why do you tilt your hips like this versus like that? And I'm like, Jesus Christ, who gives a shit? Is my back rounding? No. Am I hitting depth? Yes. Well, there's all kinds of ways to squat after you do that at a foot position. And the eccentric control, like I noticed you're doing 3-second eccentrics, but you're not pausing at the bottom. What's up with that? There's nothing fucking up with that. It's just something I chose. So whatever way you choose to train that doesn't violate any of the general principles and any of the stuff Menno and I talked about, pick that, dope it out for a couple of months, let it piss away its variation, change it up to another effective way, do that for a couple of months. That's how you improve. There's no fucking magic to any of this shit. There's people think, okay, so I noticed that you seem to pause for 2 seconds on shoulder presses, but for 1 second on bench press. What's up with that? There's never an answer to that that's going to be like, there's something up with that. Not in hypertrophy training. In strength training, people have technique setups, blah, blah, blah. But in hypertrophy training, just get in safely and intelligently and in a normalized way, similar to session to session, get the work done. And if you're thinking too much about any of that shit within there, you're just literally pissing away your time. Like, I swear to God, like the people I coach don't lift anything like I do. Like in actual lifting, they like take their technique looks a little different. They'll use a little different pauses. You'd be like, Dr. Mike, why do you have your lifter doing that? Because I don't tell them to do that or not. I just say 10 reps in the squat, pause or not, control eccentric or not, like slow control or not. And after that, they just do it how they do it. So I think a lot of that, Menno, can you rant on that with me, please? There's over obsession with details that just go nowhere.
Sure, yeah, it's a bit different topic, but I think overcueing is something that coaches, also coaches, but individuals as well, are often guilty of. Like they try, you see with PTs in the gym a lot, like they're next to someone, and interestingly here in Portugal, and it's actually the worst. It's like they're making a statue of art, and they're like, hey, the elbow position should just be a little bit more like that. And you're like, you're doing dumbbell rows with 10 pounds. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's not enough weight in any way you do it. So, and it's really bad. You should see it. But it's the only country I've seen this. But in general, like with the squat, like Mike said, there are a few general principles you want to uphold to in the squat, and then the rest is often very much dictated by someone's individual anthropometry. It will look different for anyone, and there are a lot of different ways, even within a given individual, you can squat very effectively. So I think this is also what I'll try to do. Use the minimal amount of use you can get someone to perform an exercise well, and also rely a lot on someone's intuitive way they perform an exercise, because the human motor cortex is actually pretty damn efficient. If you look at how much space it occupies in the brain, how effective it is, how we can produce movement. I mean, try throwing a ball in in a bin over there or something. That movement, you can do it intuitively. I mean, the amount of muscle coordination and the exact muscles involved and everything, there's no way even a computer cannot do it yet. So look at what we can do with robots. You know how hard it is to make a robot walk, just a regular walk? It's insanely difficult. And that just illustrates how extremely effective our motor cortex is. So I often use the analogy, if you're trying to overcue, it's a bit like overclocking the motherboard of your computer with a kitchen knife. It's a really rudimentary method to mess with an extremely evolved system. So yeah, don't overcue.
Real quick, just to get your rant on this, it's a little off topic, but if I don't know if Steve wants to include it or not. What do you think of posture obsession in the PT community? Give it to me, Menno. I want it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a different topic. Probably not one for this one, but
just give me a taste.
Yeah, I think posture obsession is huge. I mean, there are so many issues with it. For one, there's no such thing as ideal posture. That is a complete myth. I mean, like anterior tilt. If you look at anterior tilt, it's like, I have anterior tilt. It's a big problem. I need to fix this. And if you look at the research, most people have anterior tilt. It's just a matter of degree. It's actually, I think it's like 60% of the population has a few degrees of anterior tilt. And some people have extremely large anterior tilt, and it doesn't have to be pathological. I think it's a very sad state of affairs that as human beings, we think of, it's basically Nazi thinking, right? That there's this ideal structure of the human body that we're supposed to have. And if you do not have that structure, that's a problem. Like, what's a problem? Pain is a problem. Dysfunction is a problem. Not having that kind of posture is not a problem if it doesn't have any symptoms associated with it. It can actually be beneficial. Like, you know, some runners, they have extreme post or anterior pelvic tilt, and it actually is extremely biomechanically advantageous for sprinting. So their, you know, weird, off, non-optimal posture actually turns out to be the reason they win Olympic medals. So that's one thing to shade it. Is it really a problem? Then can you correct it? Like with many things in physiotherapy, it's if many physiotherapists have clients that do not even lift, most of their clients. So the solution, am I still there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the solution is often you get them to exercise. That problem does not occur in strength trainees, and especially not for overuse injuries, which is the vast majority of injuries for most serious trainees that have good exercise technique. So all of these things like muscle balance and trying to correct, doing more external rotation work and ever, it's often just very silly if you think about it. Like you have a powerlifting medal winner comes to a physiotherapist. Physiotherapist is like, yeah, you have weak back muscles. Are you serious? Like, you cannot correct it. If you can correct it, it's often because there's something like really wrong with your program, like muscle balance and stuff. That becomes an issue if you're for years you're training like a complete bro and not doing back work. But if you are training all your muscle groups, then it's very unlikely you have such a strong muscle imbalance. It's actually pulling your posture out of whack. So yeah. That's just the tip of the iceberg on the amount of issues I have with the claims people make about posture.
Yeah. I like the one claim that always it's just immediately apparent that it's fucked up is like, you should sit up straighter. It's better for your back. I'm like, mm-hmm. So the actively trying to sit up in an uncomfortable way requires the constant activation of a lot of musculature. Like, mm-hmm. You don't see that as a problem for chronic muscular fatigue and then actual pain? Like, okay, sweet. I can tell you thought that through a lot. Great. How about this? Sit in a way that doesn't hurt you and is really comfortable. Look, I just solved the sitting crisis. Isn't that insane? Where's my Nobel Prize in physiology or whatever? Apparently the way I literally had people at seminars be like, Dr. Mike, I noticed the way you were sitting, and I'm like, okay. And what do you think about posture? I'm like, go fuck yourself. I was comfortable, and they're like, well, you should sit. Great. I weigh 110 kilos. I'm gonna sit. Look at my chest up the entire time. I don't know how long can you guys sit with your British student desk style with your chest. I can sit like that for 30 seconds and I'm like, my fucking back is cramping. Fuck you. But apparently it's almost like a morality to posture. Like people see someone walking with a slightly, lordotic upper back and they'll be like, oh, look at that person. Like, oh, wow, yeah, he's a bad person. Like, fuck you. Also, that person's set up to deadlift. Sweet. Anytime I see someone with lower back lordosis and, a kyphotic upper back and longer arms, I'm like, oh my God, get that person a barbell. Amazing.
Yeah, it reminds me of it's like a naturalistic fallacy type thing where it's like, oh, that's how we should be. I think it's just the only thing I can say is a personal bias is I think good posture does look better in some ways. So if you're a presenter with good posture, generally he comes across a bit better or she. But
if it takes you heaven and earth to keep reminding yourself to stand up maximally straight all the time, are you really trying to impress people all the time? You know what I mean? You go into the store or riding your bike, who gives a shit? When you give it a presentation, you want to go manly and shit. But it gets to a point where it's absurd and you don't even know why you're doing it. You're like, well, I have to go like this. Okay, hey, if you feel so inclined to consistently stick out your chest, great. But it's again that sort of magical thinking there of thinking man, there's some real good reason why we need this perfect posture. And I don't know, Menno, do you know who what the hell is a functional patterns? Do you guys know functional patterns on Instagram and stuff like that? There's a guy who coaches, helps people in the United States. So everything he does is with either bands or Bosu balls or rotational movements. He calls athletes that do sagittal plane movements limited, and he says he coaches MMA guys and fighters, and I've actually challenged him to an MMA match before where he get to start either with a choke in or with mounting me, and I would still probably murder him. He didn't take the challenge. He just accused me of steroid use and didn't take the challenge. But this is a person who's obsessed with posture, and they literally they're in a little group. They have a picture of a power lifter just standing there, and they just ridicule them for how terrible their posture is. And you look at those people that are ridiculing, they weigh 70 kilos and they're decrepit looking, but they're like this. And you're like, wow. You're just at the height of human achievement here. But they really do believe that just posture is everything. And I think, like Menno mentioned, it starts in that sort of like bastardization of PT kind of crowd, where you're taught for several years to diagnose everything as a disease, and then all of a sudden everything is a disease, so you can just fix everything. Anyway.
No, definitely. I don't know if you guys have time. This only reminds me of a kind of perfect form. And I know, Mike, you've talked about perfect form before, and you're kind of quite a stickler for having kind of good form on exercises. I don't know if, Menno, you have different thoughts, or you're very much along the same lines, like you should have kind of that almost timeless form where you're using full range of motion, or do you ever like a bit of kind of momentum or swinging to be involved?
Yeah. Perfect form is technique that satisfies all the principles you're aiming to achieve, I think. So it's usually a range of possible variations. Like we talked about for the squat, there isn't one way you can sit a little bit more back. You can have, your feet out, probably anywhere from like 5 to 45 degrees. If you have a good structure for squatting, then that whole range might work for you. And range of motion, I am a very big stickler with. I never let clients sacrifice range of for more weights, because that is a slippery slope that just leads to ego lifting. And at the end of the 3 months later, you're like, oh, actually, if I'm strict with my range of motion, I haven't progressed in strength at all. So it really doesn't work. And tempo, I'm not too strict with. But if you see that they're starting to dive bomb and stuff, then yeah. It's a problem.
What about momentum?
I like momentum when it's useful and generated by body parts that you're targeting. So for like a lateral raise, I'm a big fan of momentum if you're using a dumbbell at least. So definitely use some momentum to get the weight up, because it's with the strength resistance curve matching. It's basically a form of biomechanical accommodating resistance. But if you're using momentum with other body parts, like your biceps curls look like a reverse clean, then it's taking away from the stimulus of the biceps. So, and it's not really going to stimulate muscle growth in the hips or anything. So in that case, it's cheating. So it really depends on the exercise. And going by client reports, I'd say I'm a stickler for perfect form, but perfect form within a certain range. Ticking all the I want to tick.
Great. No, I think from what I know, Mike's going to be very much along the same page.
No comment. Agreed.
Perfect. I don't know if you guys want to wrap it up there. I know I've kept you for over an hour now, and I think we've touched on some amazing points I think the listeners are going to really enjoy. And I really hope Mike's point in terms of kind of don't get caught up in the minutiae and really look at the overall kind of grounding principles and take those into consideration, because we're all individuals, we're all very different. And that's why we auto-regulate things, and these practices are coming out, such as kind of auto-regulating rest periods and stuff like that. So no, thank you guys. Brilliant talk.
Yeah, I'll just add one more super quick thing with posture. It's again a different topic, but I guess this podcast is going to be a bit of a mix of everything. The idea that the pencil test, that is the stupidest thing ever. The idea that you have to, if you hold two pencils, they should be pointing straight ahead, both, and otherwise you have internally rotated shoulders. I mean, have these people ever done this test on a lot of people? That doesn't work for the vast majority of people. It's just, I'd say that the average, it's like you have to hold two pencils, and the idea is that they have to point straight. So your arms would have to be like this. And normally they're writ like this. So like you have your arms beside your body, you're holding two pencils like in the.
Oh, fuck.
Right. You're gonna have major internal rotations. Super bad posture.
Who gives a shit where they point?
Yeah, well, the idea is that it should be it's actually external rotation, but the neutral should be straightforward is the idea, which is based on absolutely nothing. So it's just idea, what is neutral? Yeah, straightforward, right? So that it should be straightforward. And it doesn't work with anyone, like no one. Like there's maybe a few people that walk like this, right? And they may have that posture.
That's quite hilarious. I'll only say it was quite hilarious because that used to be one of my tests that I had in when I was first as a PT. It used to be a test that I'd give people coming into the gym, was the pencil test with the hands, and then also feet. How would they just naturally stand? Like, were they pointed out or in, or where they were? But obviously since learning that it's not such an issue, which is actually a load of people's minds, I think.
Mm-hmm. I remember I had that test, and I had it. And I'm like, oh, damn, I'm so internally rotated. I did all this external rotation work or whatever. And guess what? Pencil test result didn't change for one bit.
You should have just done more external rotation stuff. I like to do those tests, but conclude things that people aren't prepared to hear. Like, I take their limb measurements and which way their toes point, and I just do some math, and they're like, okay, what do you think? I'm like, this says here you're morally bankrupt. And they're like, well, I could have told you that, I didn't need a test. That would be really sweet, huh? Anthropometrical Assessment of Moral Character, Israetel et al. 2019. Wait for that article. It's going to be amazing.
Perfect. And with that, I'll call it a day, because otherwise I will keep you here forever. So as always, thank you guys massively for coming on the show, and thank you to all the listeners for staying tuned. We will talk to you soon.